Heating your basement, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Hit the sting. Hello and welcome to the Adding Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Mick Lane, but you can call me Sir. Today we're talking about heating your basement. I'll eventually do one called Heating Your House, but specifically for heating your basement, I wanted to talk about a few things and a few considerations. Had a friend asking me about this and thought it would be a good one to do now. Kind of hitting the end of the heating season here. It's approaching April. So I wanted to talk to you guys about some thoughts I had. The first one is I'd like you to think about how finished your basement is. So, hey, I'm in a basement now. I've got wallboard. I've got nothing special on the floors. This level of basement, I would say you're pretty much okay to start with as far as adding heating to. If you're in your basement, you're looking around and you're seeing the back of block, you're seeing a hand-troweled floor, if you're seeing subfloor and floor joists, you probably want to consider insulation, and you probably want to definitely air seal. So as far as considering insulation, I would look at what code is. I would look at what's commonly done. For insulation in basements, it's better to have none at all than to do it wrong. So make sure if you are going to insulate, you know what you're doing and you do it right. If not, it's better to not do it at all. Air sealing, on the other hand, is something that's a little more achievable. So for air sealing for block, there's a bunch of different options. It could be as little as paint. It could be mortar. It could be plaster. It could be house wrap. There's all kinds of things you could do. Talk to your local professionals if you don't know what you're doing. And then for the rest of it, the goal is to keep the air in the space. So if you have holes between your basement and the upstairs for chimneys, for whatever, you want to try to keep the air in the space. You can use things like expanding foam, caulk, backer rod. If you don't know what those things are, go do a bunch of Googling and figuring out what those things are. But I would seal around windows. I would seal around penetrations. All those things I would do to try to keep the air in your basement so that when you're heating it, you keep the air in. The next thing I would consider is how much time you spend in the basement. And I'm going to set the break-even point between these two options at something like 1 day per week. If you're down in your basement like 1 day per week for something like 5 hours a day, you're talking about, for a 20-week heating season, being down there for about 100 hours. 100 hours is like 1/80th of the heating season, or 1/80th of the year. So if you're doing that, I think you can probably get away with just about anything for options. So if you're at that 1 day for 8 hours a day or 5 hours a day, even if you're at 20 weeks, and it's crazy windy here. If it's at 20 weeks and 10 hours per day, you're still only at 200 hours per year, which is still less than a 40th of the year. It's to the point where I still wouldn't necessarily get too concerned about how many hours I'm heating with. First answer, electric heat. So why am I saying electric heat? Electric heat is really easy. So it can be as simple as the electric unit heater or electric space heater. So the electric space heater is the thing you plug into the wall. You turn it on. They range in wattage from somewhere from like 500 to 1600 watts. When you're dealing with those, they're about $40 to $100. You go buy one, you put it in. A lot of the issues we had with electric space heaters, we fixed, right? They have tip sensors. They have thermostats built into them. They have little cages around the elements. The fact that I almost set a jacket on fire on one when I was 5 years old, really almost none of that stuff can happen anymore unless you're really trying. So standard little electric heaters, 1 or 2 to heat your basement, probably a pretty good use of your money. The next step up from that would be electric baseboard. So when you're installing electric baseboard is generally 500 watts per linear foot. So if you had one that was, say, 4 feet long, it would be something on the order of 2,000 watts. That big, it's probably going to need its own circuit breaker. The good things about electric baseboard, number one, it's quiet. Number two, You can control it with a programmable thermostat. You can use it on and off. It doesn't freeze, it doesn't leak, it doesn't melt. They're pretty simple and easy. And any electrician can run you a circuit to power them. You could put in disconnects and relays so that it doesn't turn on if it's over a certain temperature outside. It doesn't love water, but it doesn't hate moisture. So they're a very robust answer. And for something between $500 and say $1,200, you can probably heat your basement. A good rough estimate is about 1 foot of baseboard for every 10 square foot of basement. So if you had 100 square foot of basement, 10 feet of baseboard, a 4 and a 6, 2 4s and a 2, however you want to work those numbers out, 300, 400 square feet. Now you're going to need some pretty serious stuff. The last option with electric heat would be an electric unit heater. Electric unit heater is like a giant hair dryer. They normally start somewhere around 1,500 watts, go up to like 4,000 watts. They can also be controlled by thermostats. Usually they like to control themselves, but if you had to go down to your basement and turn it on, say 40 minutes before the football game came on, an electric unit heater would do a pretty good job of getting heat throughout the whole space and keeping it warm. With the fan, they're a little noisier, pretty significant on the electrical consumption. You're definitely talking an electrician coming in, putting in a circuit breaker and whatever else you might need. They can be recessed into the wall. They can be hung from the ceiling. You can do 1 or 2. There's a bunch of options with them. They're not crazy expensive. If I was thinking electric unit heaters, I'd be pricing somewhere around $2,000 to heat a basement. If you're going to be down there more than 5 to 10 hours one day a week, I start thinking about using an alternative fuel, right? So now we're talking about probably natural gas or LP. Yes, you could use a solid fuel like pellets. You could use something like cordwood. You could use anything, right? You could put a wood stove in, use those types of fuels. Those tend to be much more complicated. Pellet stoves vent pretty easy, but you got to get one through the wall. You got to store the pellets. So I'm not really going to talk about those. Much more likely would be to have something like a natural gas or a propane fueled, self-contained, sometimes they're called ventless furnaces or wall furnaces or heaters or unit heaters. The wood everybody says is Rinnai, because Rinnai makes a couple and they're pretty robust. They're pretty simple. They don't take a lot for installation and they don't take a lot for operation. These types of heaters break down into 2 types. Those 2 types are vented and ventless or vent-free. The thing with vent-free is that there's nothing going outside of the room. Now, because there's nothing going outside the room, they're cheaper to install. They tend to be simpler, but all the fuel that goes into it, the products of combustion are then added to the room. So there's a little bit of moisture. Generally, that wouldn't be a problem for me. But the other problem would be is that they're creating carbon dioxide. Honestly, I don't care about the carbon dioxide. I care about carbon monoxide. So if this thing ever gets clogged or jammed or dented or damaged, you're now going to be looking at something that's going to be either putting unburned fuel into the room or half combusted fuel, which means carbon monoxide. If you still think this is a good option for you, that's fine. Just make sure you put a carbon monoxide detector in the room and put it like belt high in the room. So something like 30 inches off the ground. Because having that sensor 30 inches off the ground should generally be telling you if you're accumulating significant amounts of carbon monoxide before the point where you're breathing it. So if you're going to sleep on the floor, all right, put it a little lower. But generally all you're looking at is if I'm hanging out in my basement for a little bit of time, if there was carbon monoxide down there, it fills bottom to top. Would the sensor be going off before my health would be at risk? So carbon monoxide sensor low, and you can take care of that. The types of things we're talking about is people, number one, putting stuff against it. Number two, damaging it. Number three, being subjected to excessive corrosion. So if you don't store like pool chemicals or strange things in your basement, lacquer thinners, etc., and you don't have kids who are destructive or constructive with things that like maybe make heat. But if you can see your kids building a fort with this thing in it, that's not really what you want. Next one would be vented. Venting these types of furnaces is really easy if you have some level of exposure to the wall. So if you have a walkout basement, put this somewhere near the walkout. You vent through the wall. Very easy to do. Very simple installation and operation. You then just have to make sure that the venting outside the wall meets the requirements of the manufacturer, be it for snow line or whatever, so that the vent doesn't get blocked up and then you get the same problems you have with the ventless. Generally, these are pretty cheap. Most people can give you a over-the-phone price for purchase and install of one, assuming you don't have anything too weird at your house. I would anticipate that number to be somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000. It might be a little more, it might be a little less, depending on where you live or the size you need. But those would be the kind of numbers I'd be thinking about for a standalone heater connected to a natural gas or LP gas supply for heating a basement. The final option, generically speaking, would be to connect your basement heating system to the same heating system you use for the rest of your house. So number one, I'm assuming that you're already heating your house with something that looks like a heating system in North America in a heating climate. So I'm talking about a gas-fired furnace or boiler, steam, hot water, forced air. All those things are going to have the ability to add a zone or add additional space to that furnace. People are going to say, like, is my furnace big enough and whatever? Generally speaking, they are. Unless your furnace is already having trouble keeping up, if it runs for more than 30 minutes per hour, if your boiler never shuts off or takes forever to recover, say 10 degrees in your house, then there might be issues. But generally speaking, there is a bunch of capacity left in the system. Most of that being because if you do heat your basement, you then have less heating load for the rest of the system. So the spaces above the basement, around the basement, adjacent. So generally capacity is not the issue. Now, what it looks like to add on to that existing system is a few $1,000s. It might require dampers. It might require another thermostat. It might require some modifications of the existing system. And then it's going to require whatever's coming over to heat that space. So forced air system, generally we're looking at additional ductwork and possibly a couple dampers. If we're looking at a boiler, we're talking about either another pump or zone valve, some piping, and then something to add heat to that space. Same thing with steam. Whatever you're using to do that, oil for a boiler too. Adding another water zone is relatively easy. For that, what you would use would probably be something like a unit heater or baseboard or convector. Those are all fairly similar to their electrical versions. Electrical baseboard, electrical convector, electrical unit heater. Unit heater being the fan and the coil. Just now the coil is either steam or water with a fan on it. I would, again, think that that number is going to fall somewhere around the range of $3,000. Not necessarily because we're talking about so many dollars in material and product, but whoever changes your system to add this space is going to own the change that they perform to the system. So adding additional ductwork to your furnace is probably not going to be a problem. But if there's a problem with your furnace afterward, the techs are going to have to show up and make it work right, even though they may not have caused the problem by adding some additional ductwork, adding a few registers, or changing the return air or whatever. The other thing is when you add it to your whole house heating system, you're going to heat it a lot more than 1 day a week. So if you are only down there a couple days a week, by adding the heating of that space on for the whole year, you might add, say, 10 or 20% to your heating usage of your billing. There's a lot of implications, there's a lot of details. Generally, you're going to want to get someone who does a lot of these types of installations to get their opinions and their feedback on these things. I would generally discuss with them the concepts of adding insulation, air sealing, and then the options, whether you're doing electric, gas, and whether it's a standalone device like a Rinnai infrared heater, something like that, or if it is something different like adding to your system. A good tech will know how to put a water pump on a steam boiler to steal the condensate to heat the space. There's a lot of tricks. There's a lot of things like that. As far as you understanding how the system works, it's more important that you have something that you're comfortable with, something that you understand, something that you know how to turn on and off and how it's changing your system, potential problems it might bring. But generally speaking, I would look at the existing condition of your basement, how finished you would say. If it's above a 4 for being finished, I wouldn't worry about insulating. I might do some air sealing, and then I would consider how much I'm down there for whether I'm going electric or whether I'm going with a fossil fuel, natural gas, propane, etc. So there are a handful of thoughts for heating your basement. With a focus and a thought paid towards energy efficiency and utility costs. If you have questions, reach out. Adding Energy on Twitter, addingenergy@gmail.com, and you can reach out on our website, addingenergy.com. So feel free to reach out and talk to us. And until next time, thanks for giving a watch.